I just want to do God's will.
What you're seeking is a blessing from God.
You must expect a miracle.
You have the power of choice.
Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ.
Welcome to Life Today Live. Randy Robinson here. Great to have you today. And today is going to be, I think you're going to enjoy this. I have, over the years, had several conversations with Philip Yancey, who is one of the most respected writers in Christendom today, and for very good reason. He's real, he's deep, he's thoughtful, and he's frankly a great writer. So that helps as well. But he has a new book out, and it's different from any other book that he's published. It's called Where the Light Fell. And this particular book, I prep for a lot of shows and pick up books and scan through them. This one I just couldn't put down, and so I just read it, and it was interesting. It was beautiful and troubling at the same time. And I think you'll understand. And so I am just thrilled to have Philip Yancey. Philip, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and talk to us today.
Oh, it's a delight to be with you again, Randy.
So I guess we should start where everybody starts, which is why such a personal book this time?
You're sure right that it's different than anything I've done before. All of my books have been kind of idea-driven books. I call them personal pilgrimage. They're exploring questions of faith. Who is Jesus? What is grace? Does prayer work? You know, those questions we all have at some point. This one's different. It's a story. And I suppose it's the backstory on all my other books. It explains how I ended up as a Christian writer to begin with, because I was not on that trajectory growing up. Mm-hmm. I was trying to get away from God and get away from the church as quickly as I could. And yet through a whole series of circumstances, I did end up in the arms of God. And I wrote the book as a book of hope for people who have gone through or are going through, or maybe have kids that are going through similar ups and downs with their own faith.
I was shocked in a lot of places, and I'll let you tell the stories, but you were raised around some really awful religious circumstances.
I was. It was a tiny little church in my high school days. We actually lived on the church property. It was a converted pony farm. So the barn became a tabernacle where we met. And a family of three, my mother, older brother, and I lived in a trailer, only 8 by 48 feet wide or long, 8 feet wide, 48 feet long, on the church property. So we could never get away from church. There was a revival service week long every summer, and they would put up a big tent right in our front yard. And of course we had to go every time the doors were open. My mother was in charge of Christian education there. So we got the full dose, and it was pretty extreme fundamentalist religion. We looked down and thought heaven would be a very, very small place, maybe slightly larger than our church, but probably not. And it was, this was in the South, right as the civil rights movement was going on. And a lot of things were happening in the 60s. Our church was on the wrong side of every one, frankly, especially the race issue, which became a big crisis of faith for me. In the introduction there, you heard some of those great quotes from civil rights leaders. And my church was opposing them and taking the wrong side and teaching these pretty awful theories about the inferiority of people of color. When I found out they weren't true, that became a crisis of faith for me.
That wasn't the only one. You mentioned growing up with your brother and your mother. Tell us what was going on in the family there.
Yeah, the book starts where my life starts. I was just a year old. I had no conscious memory of anything at that point, of course. And my father got polio. He was only 23. He and my mother were planning to go to Africa as missionaries, and they already had their support lined up. They had several thousand people on a mailing list who agreed to pray for them and send them financial support. But then he got polio, and it was a terrible disease. That was the pandemic everybody feared back then, especially because it mostly affected children. As I mentioned, he was 23, he wasn't a child. And here he was, just out of the out of the Navy in World War II with all of life ahead of him. And suddenly, overnight, literally, he was paralyzed completely, couldn't move his head, couldn't move anything, his arms, legs, and he couldn't even breathe on his own. So he was put in one of these iron lung machines that would contract and expand in a vacuum and breathe for him, just force his lungs to work. But that was no life. He's lying in this machine. It's noisy. He's in an open ward, always lit. Charity hospital, didn't get very good care. The people who were praying for him became convinced that he would be healed. So they did pray and believed that why would God take somebody with such potential who wanted to be a missionary to serve God? Why would God allow somebody like that to die? So they took him out of that iron lung against medical advice and moved him to a little clinic that was really not equipped to deal with people in his condition. And it looked pretty good for the first few days. He thought maybe he was recovering some movement in his toe, and he was so much more comfortable in this place. And in fact, there was a big article on him in the Atlanta Constitution magazine where he lived. And when I looked at that article, and I only found this out as an adult, I saw the date, and it was 9 days before he died. Mm. So suddenly, a lot of things clicked into place, because my mother, of course, felt guilty, felt betrayed by God, but she couldn't really express that. You know, you're not supposed to be mad at God. So she did something else. She decided, okay, he's dead. I'm going to have my sons replace him. Mm. So I will commit them and give them to God to be missionaries in Africa. And that's the only thing, that's it. They've got to do that. And you can understand this distraught widow, her life just tragically interrupted. And she wanted to hang on to her faith, and she wanted to somehow overcome this mistake. It was really a theological mistake that they had made. So she gave her sons over with a very clear message. This is what they're going to do. Well, we were teenagers, and we were teenagers, do I say more? You know, we weren't turning out exactly as she had scripted. We weren't bad kids, but we weren't planning to be missionaries in Africa. And that became became almost a poison eating away at our family. And when my brother wanted to go into music, he was an incredibly talented musician. He wanted to go to a conservatory of music. She kind of freaked out. She pursued getting federal kidnapping charges against him for the person who was going to drive him to the university. And then she said she would pray every day that he would be in a terrible accident and either die or, better yet, be paralyzed. And remember how my father died. Be paralyzed so that he could look at this ceiling and realize what a terrible thing he was doing. And that shows that kind of toxic power. What was originally an offering to God became a kind of curse on my brother. And it indeed worked out. He lost his mind. He was diagnosed paranoid schizophrenic. He dropped out of college his very last semester, became one of Atlanta's original hippies. And our story, our family story, is the story of two brothers going very opposite directions. Mm-hmm. He went one way, ended up in California like a lot of hippies. And I went another way. I became a Christian writer. And that was just as surprising, actually, because I wasn't headed in that direction at all.
Well, you know, the amazing thing is that, you know, given the hurt that your mother was operating under, the confusion, all the really tough emotions, combined with a lot of bad theology, I mean, that's a recipe for disaster. On so many levels. And
when it's a religious thing, I mean, you step outside of Christianity and look at these ISIS members who will put a bullet or a bomb vest on a 10-year-old child, on a 12-year-old girl, and say, now you go out there and just pull the cord. Why would you possibly do that, we think? And yet it's that same kind of distortion of, okay, I'm going to act for God. These are heathens out there, and the more we kill, the better it is. I mean, that's their theology. And my mother's theology wasn't quite the same, but it was, I know God's will. And one of the confusing things for me growing up Randy, was that a lot of people claimed to speak for God, and it turned out they were wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, the people who prayed for my father loved him. They wanted to support him, and they thought they knew God's will, but they were wrong. We don't have the right to determine a person's future. And my mother as well, when she decided what was God's will for us, she didn't give us any vote in that.
Yeah.
And God doesn't act like that. God, when you look at how people run away from God, all the way through the Old Testament and the prodigal son, the story there, God always is standing there giving people another chance. Come back. But he doesn't twist them. He doesn't manipulate them.
Yeah.
I think of the rich young ruler that Jesus had a conversation with, and Jesus said, here's what you need to do. And the guy didn't want to do it. So he walked away. And in Mark's version, he says, and Jesus loved him.
Mm.
He didn't chase after him and say, well, maybe we can negotiate. Here, let me talk you into this. He just said, well, that's your choice. I'm sorry, I think it's the wrong choice, but I'm going to love you anyway. And we could all take a lesson from that, because it's easy to think, if we know God's will, then we're the ones who are supposed to manipulate others into doing it. And it doesn't work that way.
And I think that's a key word, is manipulation, because we still see a lot of that in the church, unfortunately. And it's almost like some people don't even know they're doing it, or they justify it because they're on God's side, which is a lot of what you were seeing, man. Go ahead.
And that can be so dangerous. Yeah. You're absolutely right, Randy. And I would add to that, though, that at a certain point, especially for young people, at a certain point, you begin to separate out God from the church. When you're young, it all goes together. You go to church to learn about God, and everybody is worshiping the same God and all that. But then later, you do hear these discrepancies going on, where the image of God that I took away from church was of this giant bully who's trying to break people and make them into what he wants. And later I found out that's not true at all. It certainly wasn't true of Jesus. And that's confusing as you're developing, just to learn to separate out, what is God like? Because God is not like my church taught me at all. In fact, I wrote a book called The Jesus I Never Knew. I didn't know that Jesus, because when I was growing up, he was a very different character. And when I got to know the real Jesus, I saw his compassion and his love and his grace. And it was so different than that hellfire and brimstone church I grew up in.
Yeah. We're talking to Philip Yancey about his new autobiographical book. It's called Where the Light Fell. You can pick it up wherever you get books, and I would highly encourage you to get this one. It's a great read. It's difficult at times, and yet it's beautiful, because you start to understand his other books. I really find it interesting, Philip, that you even talk about how your other books were kind of you working out who God is, and having to deconstruct and reconstruct your own faith after coming from such a religious, manipulative, frequently wrong background. Talk us through some of your books and your journey.
Sure. Well, looking back, I feel very blessed, Randy, because as you say, I've been able to actually make a living by working out questions of my faith. So I grew up just completely saturated in religion. I couldn't get away from it. And I had all the words, I had the knowledge, but it just wasn't fitting together for me. And then God met me in a very dramatic way, something that I wasn't even expecting or wanting at the time, but changed my life forever. And ever since, I've been going through picking up what I was handed growing up in that church environment and deciding, is this worth keeping, or is this something that people have put on the Bible, put on God that wasn't really there? Sorting through, and reconstruction is a good word. A lot of kids are doing that, especially these days. And I feel honored. So I remember I wrote a book called Disappointment with God. one of my first books. My first two books were Where is God When It Hurts and Disappointment with God. So you can kind of see where I was. I was out here in the margins, you know. I don't know if I can buy this stuff or not. And the publisher said to me, boy, I don't know about a title like Disappointment with God. Maybe you should do something like Having Overcome Disappointment with God. And I said, no, I don't want to reach people who've overcome it. I want to reach people who are in the middle of it. Because actually you can look at the Bible and there's a lot of disappointment with God in the Bible. Psalms, Lamentations, most of the prophets, Jeremiah. And I was able to go through and explain that and deal with my own questions. The same thing was, what is Jesus really like? I had this distorted view of Jesus growing up, kind of the Sunday school cardboard cutout Jesus, like Mr. Rogers Jesus, you know, and there was part of that, but Jesus was also fierce and creative and brilliant and intelligent and elusive. And I wanted to find out what Jesus was really like. And when I did that, I wanted to be more like that Jesus. I wanted to get to know that Jesus. Prayer. We all have questions about why do some prayers seem to get answered and some prayers don't get answered? What am I doing wrong if my prayers don't get answered, if anything? And I feel so blessed that for almost 50 years now, I've been able to go back and just look at every piece of faith that's important to me and try to figure out, okay, what's the reality here? I don't think I got the reality in that tiny little judgmental church. So what is the reality and how should that be affecting me?
Yeah. You got to tell the story about your prayer with your college buddies, because I love it. It reflects a couple of things. One of them being your honesty, which is what people appreciate so much. But you got to tell that story because sure. I love that story.
Okay, I will. Yeah, you hear people say, I was saved from drugs, I was saved from alcohol, I was saved from the church, Randy. That's my story. And I was fed up to here. My mother was a Bible club teacher. We lived on church property. And then I ended up in a Bible college of all places. And I was the unhappiest person on campus. And I kind of liked, I liked that role. I was the renegade. I would sit out in the patio and read a book like Why I Am Not a Christian by Bertrand Russell, you know, things. And people saw me as the renegade, the heretic, and that was okay. I was. So you had to have a Christian service assignment at this school. And I signed up for one that sounded pretty interesting, evangelizing a local university nearby.
Of course.
So I tried that once or twice. Yeah.
You're the perfect
guy. It didn't go well at all, you know. So I decided, okay, got to come out here every Saturday night. I'll just go to the student center. And man, that was cool. They had TVs. We didn't have TVs on the Bible college campus. And I would watch basketball games mostly. And then we'd go back and we'd report about, the other guys would report about how many people they witnessed to, and I had nothing to report. And each week we had a prayer meeting. So it went like this. Joe would pray, Craig would pray, Chris would pray, and then they would wait about 10 seconds, and I never prayed. And then they'd say, okay, great, see you next week. And I was given an assignment in a class to write a paper about when God spoke to you. I didn't know what in the world to say because God had never spoken to me, I thought. And most of the people who said God spoke to them, I questioned, I doubted. Mm-hmm. So I was kind of confused about that, but I was thinking about it in the back of my mind. The prayer meeting started, Joe prayed, Craig prayed, Chris prayed. And for some reason, I started praying. I said, God, and everybody was kind of startled because I had never prayed. And I said, you know, we're supposed to care about those 10,000 people at that university. And I don't care if they all go to hell. And on our Bible college campus in a prayer meeting, I might as well have been doing human sacrifice or witchcraft. I mean, it was you could cut the tension with a knife. And then I said, I don't even care if I go to hell. Mm. Whoa, I mean, I am raising the stakes here. And I don't know why I did that, but I did. And it was true. It was honest. I didn't care. And then I guess I'd say for sure a revelation. Maybe it was a vision. I actually saw, we had been studying the parable of the Good Samaritan, and I saw the victim, the person who had been robbed and beaten, lying in the ditch, covered with blood, and lying in the mud. And I looked closely, and it was me. It was my face. And then I saw the Samaritan reaching down, helping this victim, and it was the face of Jesus. Now, this is not what the parable is about at all, but this is what I saw in that revelation. And here's the face of Jesus reaching down to help me. And every time he reached down, I would spit in his face. And suddenly it exposed me. I was the neediest one of all. Here I thought I was as sophisticated, smarter than those guys. I'm not buying this Christian stuff. I'm intelligent, I'm sophisticated. And yet I'm the neediest one of all. And every time God reached down for me, I would spit in his face. And that was, it was just stunning. And I stopped talking and just got up and walked out of the room. And these guys are pretty cool. They didn't say anything to me about it, but I wrote that up in the paper about how God spoke to me and stood up in class. And again, with the reputation of the apostate, I told this story and it changed everything for me. Just that switch of roles. I saw myself as the one in need of grace. And I saw God as the one who is a master at giving grace. And those two came together, and everything's been different since that night.
Yeah, I love it. And we wonder if God really is talking to people, and we wonder about people's claims. I don't doubt that story, and I love the beauty of it. And part of the reason I think is God is the unexpectedness of it.
Yeah,
and then
when you grow up, you know this well, Randy. When you grow up in a church environment, you kind of learn to go through the motions. You learn to give a testimony, you learn to pray, you learn to do the Bible quizzes, whatever. And at a certain point, that feels genuine. And other points, you're just kind of play acting. You're just playing the role. You've learned how the behavior works. And then at another point, you realize, I can't tell the difference between what's fake and what's real. And that's where I was. Here I am on a Bible college campus, not believing a word of it, but I got to get the grade, so I would write the papers. That's fake. And I just didn't know, how can I tell the difference? And you're right, it was so unexpected, came out of nowhere, that at last it was something that happened to me, not something that I concocted somehow. Right. It was God reaching me. And I've hesitated to tell the whole story described in the book over the years, because people will say, well, that never happened to me. And they're right. God deals with us individually in very different ways. He deals with you in a different way than he deals with me. But I do have to say, this was a singular change moment of my life.
Yeah, and I love, God's not an idea or just some cosmic force. He's a personality, and I think that's how he expresses himself and why it's different, not the same for everyone. So, yeah,
my wife, for example, grew up as a missionary's kid in South America, and she had loving parents, and she's never been through a crisis of faith. I went through them all the time growing up, and she never did because it fit for her. What she saw expressed in her parents and the work they were doing was what she saw in the Bible. So it all fit together. She never, to this day, has never really questioned it. But I questioned everything all the time, because some of it I should have questioned.
Oh gosh, yeah. And I want to finish on that. We have just a few minutes, but I want to finish with this because it's still relevant today. And you touched on it. I mean, your church, your fundamentalist church, blatantly taught racism. I'm guessing the Mark of Cain theory or whatever. And that played out throughout your life in ways where you saw African Americans, you saw black people being mistreated by the church. And, we've come a long way, I think. Obviously, but at the same time, there's still some issues. What's your take on some of the tensions between people of different cultures?
I thought we had solved that one in the 60s. I thought the civil rights movement made the difference. And Martin Luther King was so clear about that, though. He said, we can change the laws to make white people accept black people into their restaurants and to keep them from lynching black people. But I want to change the hearts. And the government can't do that. That's got to come from within. And the church should be the place. My goodness, go back. The Apostle Paul, because he was a good Jew, would pray every day, thank you, God, that you made me a man, not a woman, that you made me a Jew, not a Gentile, that you made me free, not a slave. And so it was a very regimented society. To this day, Orthodox Jews, they won't shake my hand because I'm not one of them. But Paul, when he got the gospel, said, in Christ, there is no male nor female. There is no slave nor free. There is no Jew nor Gentile. They are all one in Christ. Yeah. And that's the power. That's the message we were given. That's why the church took root at Pentecost and just exploded people from all these different places. And they went back and carried the gospel with them. But as I tell stories in the book, my church growing up actually printed up a card. And if a black person, a civil rights activist, tried to get in the church, they would give them that card and say, you're not welcome here. You're just a troublemaker. You're not a true child of God. But if you want to know more about Jesus, you can call this number.
Yeah, what a great witness.
Yeah. And they softened a little bit over time. I think I mentioned to you, Randy, that finally there was this one Bible college student, Carver Bible College student, who liked that church and liked the Bible teaching. And by then they were letting a few black people in as observers, but he wanted to join the church. He wanted to identify with it. And they met. It was a very angry meeting and unanimously rejected his membership. His name was Tony Evans.
Yeah, that's amazing.
He's the pastor of a church of 10,000 people and runs the Potter's House Ministry, just a great neighbor to you there. And that part has changed. I don't know a church in the United States that wouldn't let a young, sincere college student into their church, regardless of their race. But we still have a long way to go to change those hearts.
Yeah, and that's what it is, and that's what I think comes through your books, is that it is about the heart, and it's about knowing God for yourself. And if that means questioning things that you've been taught, then question them, because God's a God of answers. So I appreciate your time. I appreciate you sharing and being so honest. I'll give you the last word. People read this book. Yeah, this is a standard question, but it's a good one. People read this book. What do you want them to come away with?
I want them to come away with hope. I know a lot of your listeners and viewers have people in their families that they're concerned about, kids who've turned away from the church, maybe who grew up and turned away from God. And I've got a lot of reasons to turn away from God because it was stained so badly by the church I grew up in. But when I actually put together my life in this book, stitching together the pieces of the past, there was a redemptive thread all the way through it. God can take whatever material we grow up with, whatever environment, whatever family dysfunction we grew up with, church, God can take it and somehow wrest good out of it. That's the promise we have. Not that we won't have these challenges, these doubts, whatever, but that God can deal with them and God can have an outcome that makes sense. And in looking back, yeah, there was some pain and struggle, but I don't regret any of it. Nothing got wasted. And I'm grateful looking back now to see how God used the good, the bad, and the ugly in my life.
And he can do it for anybody. He can do it for anybody out there watching, no matter what you've been through. Again, thank you, Philip. One correction program note, Tony Evans is Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship. Potter's House is TD
You're
Jones.
right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I know people are out there in the chat going, no, so that one. But yeah, and Tony Evans is a good friend of the ministry, and we love all those guys. Thanks again. I would encourage people to check out Philip's website, philipyancey.com. Looks just like this. And then, of course, you can pick up the book wherever books are sold. It will bless you. Buy it for someone who's having a crisis of faith. I think that's a great idea. And come back. We appreciate you guys hanging out with us. We'll see you again next time here on Life Today Live.
Say with the Lord, I confess my sin. No longer will I rely upon my goodness, upon my personality, but Lord, I just come as a bankrupt sinner. saying, Lord, have mercy on me.